Hello. Hello. Hi. What's up? It's me, Kiran, your favorite booktuber, and today I've got an exciting video because after a very lengthy delay, I'm coming at you with my May and June reading wrap-up. You may or may not have noticed that I didn't post my April reading wrap-up. That's because I thought it was really boring. I was primarily discussing the rest of the International Booker books that I'd read and just didn't want to go there again. If you're interested in any of those books, I have individual reviews for all of them except for Time Shelter, which ended up winning because I forgot about that book. Anyways, without further ado, let's dive right into it. I hope it's not too loud. I'm still in Bombay, traffic be trafficking, and I don't know what to do. I turned off the fan this time, so hopefully that helps with the acoustics. One of the first books that I read in May was a collection of short stories by Madeline. The collection is called Earth Angels. Very, very, very slim collection of short stories. That's kind of looking at modern life, the realities of it. It's very like Gen Z, millennial coded, and the stories are quite short. There's a little bit of irony, some humor. I would say that I don't really remember a lot of them now. It is the nature of short stories, I guess. But if you wanted to get a taste of this author's writing, about half of the short stories that are in the book are available online. So do with that what you will. Next up, I read Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton. I have been singing this book's praises. I thought it was a lot of fun. It tells a story of a vigilante group of gardeners who are all quite young and idealistic, who get involved with a nefarious, like, mega rich man from America, and the story takes place in New Zealand. This is a discussion about environmentalism, climate change, and agency. I thought it was a lot of fun. You may have heard that it's a thriller, but actually it's quite slow moving, not much happens, but I do think Eleanor Catton really takes her time to get within the psyches of these characters, and it's a good time. It's fun. You get to see different tropes of people. You have, the super wealthy guy, then you have the journalist who's going to uncover the truth, and then you have these two women who are involved as the kind of leaders of the vigilante group, and you're looking at their friendship, and there's a lot of nuance in this story. Next up, I read Uncanny Valley by Wiener. This is a memoir looking at this young woman who worked initially in the publishing industry, but then kind of had a crisis of faith where she realized she wasn't really making a lot of money and found herself questioning how does one have meaning in their work. And so she decides to move to SF. She gets a job in the tech space, but she's not a tech person, right? Like, she doesn't have the technical skills to work in a startup as, the coder or whatever. So she's kind of doing a job that engages in one's soft skills, which is important, but she's kind of tracking her personal relationship with work, but also that of a generation. And she's looking at how the startup space is so different, so it's a bubble, as are most industries, and how she's looking at the different temperaments and ideas that are permeated in this space. One that has a lot of effects and ramifications on the rest of the world because of how much money and power these companies are able to wield. I thought it was a very interesting read, and I don't know if this is maybe me looking at it as a reader of 2023. There were times where I found she was incredibly naive, and that kind of really annoyed me because, I don't know, I just felt like some of the observations were just like what did you expect going into this space? But that could just be we have different temperaments and view things differently. So Amina Cain's Opera's at Night is looking at reading and writing. It's a very brief yet moving meditation on those two topics. I really liked it. I thought it was very interesting. I would have to say I think I preferred it over her novel Indelicacy. Then I read The New Life by Tom Crewe. Now, this is an interesting book. This is a very big book, and there was a lot of build-up and at the end the payoff occurred, but it took a long time to get there, in my opinion. This tells a story of marriage, and more particularly looking at gay identity in Victorian England. At that time, people were called inverts, and so you basically have these two men who become, they're not friends, they have a working relationship. You have this older guy who's come to the realization that he is gay and he doesn't want to live a closeted life, even though his wife allows him to basically do what he does. And then you have that marriage kind of juxtaposed, well, annoying word to use, against the marriage of this newlywed couple who basically, this is a very complex book. So this new couple is a marriage based off of similar ideological views. They are two people who are part of the New Life Society, who basically believe that there's a way for men and women to live and exist in the world that is different than it was previously. So basically in this relationship, you have a marriage of almost convenience, where the woman in this relationship enters into another relationship. She prefers the company of women over men, but they still nonetheless are married. So you're looking at these two different marriages as they're tracking and moving along, as you're seeing the individuals kind of try to navigate the time that they live in, their marriages, but also their own personal desire to live a life true to themselves. And at the same time that this is happening, both the men in the relationship are engaged in a study to look at inverts in society. So they basically are conducting a study. So that's kind of an overview of the plot of the book. A little confusing to explain, but it's a very interesting novel in its exploration of marriage and Victorian ideals, and it's written in a way that feels like very engaging of the time. I think it's worth reading if this time period is of interest to you, but I would say just as a not like a cautionary tale, no, but just like as a just so you know, basically the author Tom Crewe kind of is mostly historically accurate, but did do one shift such that these two men actually are interacting, because I think in real life they didn't interact, but they were running in similar circles. So that's just so you know kind of thing. But I think it's mentioned in the author's note. Oh, also, if you do this on audio, which is how I consumed it, at the very, very end, there's an interview with the author and the person who read the narration, and I thought that was a lot of fun. Okay, next up I read Some of Them Will Carry Me. This is another collection of short stories. This one came on my radar because one of my subs, shout out my subs, I looked at their newsletter and saw them mention this book, and basically this is a very trippy short story collection. This is a collection of stories, some of them very, very short. There's a few recipes in there, and it's basically looking at women of color moving in space. And there's a kind of liminal quality to the short stories, because you can't really identify where and when these stories are happening, but they're very moody and sensual, and our author has an eye for hands. You can notice within short story collections what an author's themes or points of interest are. So for example, Madeline in Earth Angels, she's talking a lot about Lithuania, I think, and Christianity comes up a few times, and internet culture. And then with this author, Giada Scodellaro, she's had, and I still remember this, she has this interest in hands and cuticles, fingers, and also dry skin. Now personally, I have dry skin, so I actually did really find it very interesting to see this repetition of when someone's skin is dry and when it's not, because that is something I suffer with, and it's also on someone else's radar. So that was very interesting. It's like a very moody collection, and I would be curious to see how her style would translate into a novel. Chrysalis by Anna Metcalfe is the story of a woman who's trying to gain agency and be completely self-sufficient in this modern day and age. The way she decides to do this is by bodybuilding, weightlifting. We're experiencing this story not through her eyes and her perspective. We're hearing about it from 3 different people who all interact with her. So in the first part, we're hearing about this guy who meets her at the gym, and they kind of have a little entanglement. And then part 2, we're looking at the mother of this woman, and we're seeing her reflections on, giving birth to her daughter, their childhood experience. We're really looking at that like mother-daughter relationship and seeing how that evolves with time, and how, now that her daughter is doing something so extreme, like how that's impacting their relationship. And then in part 3, we're looking at this one friend of the woman who knew her before she embarked on this change, and she was kind of a safe spot for her, who helped her to move towards this change. And the story is very interesting. I think it's very like quick and easy to read if you wanted to just like do it on one weekend. It's very interesting because it's applicable to this day and age, because what ends up happening is that this woman, as she succeeds in her endeavor, somewhat becomes a bit of an influencer in the new age health and wellness space. So that like kind of commentary is a little bit interesting. I would say that there were some parts that stood out a lot stronger to me, and I think maybe it was like the first 2/3 I thought were the strongest, and then the last one, which gives you a lot more clarity on the overall situation, was the one where I felt things were lacking a little bit. And then after that, I read Ghost Music by Anne Yu. This is the author's sophomore novel, and it was annoying. So basically, the author came out with Braised Pork, which I had read when it came out, and then Ghost Music came out fairly recently. Both of these books are very atmospheric, they're very moody, and there's some really great food writing in them. In Ghost Music, we're kind of seeing another similar situation where you have an exploration of a woman in modern China who's in an unhappy marriage, and she's kind of going about her life. So in Ghost Music, the protagonist is a woman in a marriage that's not very satisfying. She wants children, her husband really doesn't, and she starts getting these deliveries of these mushrooms that are quite like fresh and very particular to a specific region of China, and she starts like digging into why she's getting them, and then she ends up meeting this pianist who has disappeared, and it's very like, it's a very evocative story. It's very ghost-like and dreamy, and it's very interesting, but I just feel like it was missing something to really like push it over the edge for me, because it maybe is almost a little too dreamlike. That's my thoughts there. Then I switched gears a little bit, and I did a nonfiction book, Lives of the Wives, which I did on audio, and I enjoyed it so much that I bought the book. I thought it was really good. I have realized that I'm kind of, initially it was subconsciously, and then I was like, whoa, there's a theme here, I'm gonna dive right into it, and I'm gonna make a separate video about it. But basically, I've been reading about marriage. The New Life may have been the kickoff of that, and then Lives of the Wives is what really put it like on my radar for real. This is a group biography looking at the marriages of 5 different literary couples, and basically looking at how marriage, the institution of marriage, and just being involved in a marriage affected the creativity of the 2 people. The author's premise, I believe, is something that kind of just saying that like women typically have to sacrifice so much of their creativity in order to kind of allow the man's creativity to flourish. And so the author looks at these 5 different couples and is looking at the sacrifices individuals need to make in order to maintain the marriage, but also like maintain their creativity, whether or not it does flourish or it doesn't. And I found it to be just really fascinating. It is a little gossipy, like these kind of things generally are when you're really like doing a deep dive on someone's personal life, but at the same time, it was very compulsive and also really harrowing. I thought it was very upsetting and depressing at times, especially towards the end. But if this is of interest to you, of the characters, of the literary figures that are involved in this biography, or people that are of interest to you, you should definitely check it out. I think I cannot sing this book's praises more. Like, I really enjoyed it. Then I read First Love by Gwendoline Riley. This is a very slim exploration of a woman's marriage, but she's also looking at her first love and her relationship with her mother. And she happens to be a writer, and she's married to this man who's very like larger than life and is also ill, and they don't really have a very healthy relationship. I think the author writes with a lot of humor, very like sharp, biting, witty sentences, but it delivered more on the mother-daughter relationship, I think, than the actual like exploration of relationships with members of the opposite sex. That's kind of where I found it to be a little lacking. After a lot of that fiction, I switched gears a little bit and I did Kitchen Confidential by Anthony Bourdain, and this was absolutely delightful. If you do it on audio, Anthony Bourdain narrates the story, and it's a memoir basically looking at his first we're seeing like why and how he got into food. Like, when did he realize this was of interest to him? And because basically he's a very like American kid whose family would summer in France, and he kind of realized that his parents like were enjoying food, that they would sometimes like go to fancy restaurants and like really savor that experience, but him and his brother were like just being really bratty kids and not being appreciative. And then someday like a switch occurs. I think it's basically when his family and a neighbor or something like that, or an uncle, they go hunting for oysters and they have to eat one, and he realizes that his parents actually don't really want to do it. They're kind of being a little fussy, and he's like, you know what, I'm going to do it, I'm going to be brave. And so he eats this oyster, and that is just his first like culinary experience, which just changes the course of his life completely. And then you see how he starts, once he gets a little bit older, he starts vacationing, kind of vacationing, but also working in like the Cape Cod area in restaurants, and like that's what he wants to do. He's now hooked. And then you trace his education and then his early restaurant experiences, and I think it's very eye-opening if you have no like prior knowledge about restaurants, hospitality, and that industry. I think he writes just really fun, super engaging, and I saw a lot of truth to it because my family is also like in this line of work, and there's so much truth to what he says about the kind of characters who get involved in working in the kitchen, and definitely would recommend. A lot of fun. After that, we switched gears again. We're always switching gears in my reading wheelhouse, and I read Atta by Jarett Kobek with Nathan from Nathan's Nook. We also happened to do this like super long live stream chat about it, and definitely check that out if you have the time, if you're interested. So Atta is Jarett Kobek's exploration of the one particular 9/11 bomber. It's a very like experimental, edgy piece of fiction. We have, in every other chapter, kind of slightly switches perspective. I think Nathan and I really go deep into this book on that live stream, but I kind of wished it went a little bit further, that it took things further, because there were some sections of the perspective that I really enjoyed, and then the other chapters where I got completely disengaged. I thought it took you out of the story completely. But it is a very interesting novel, and if you guys have any suggestions of things like that, definitely drop a line, let me know. Would love to check out some experimental edgy fiction that's, you know, doing interesting things. Okay, then the last book that I read in May was Exalted by Anna Dorn. I spoke about this in my mid-year freak out wrap-up tag. Basically, this is a very, very fun story. I wish more people were talking about this book because I think it's so much fun. Basically, we have the story of two different women. One of them is a 28-year-old astrology meme maker who actually wants to be an actress. And then the second is of this like 40-something-year-old lesbian whose life is falling apart. She's involved in these relationships that just go up in flames. She's now single, and she kind of has like temper issues. She gets mad quite fast, quite quickly, and you're seeing how they're living their life, how they're trying to navigate having a life in this modern day and age where it seems so hard to get what you want. And we're moving along, spiraling, I think is probably more accurate to say, towards what ends up being quite a explosive ending. And I thought it was so much fun, very, very engaging, the perfect like beach read in my opinion. I actually did read it on the beach a few times. If you are going away this summer, definitely check this book out. Then we're gonna move to June. Things switched up completely. So basically, I read a lot in May. I read 13 books, and I don't know, maybe there's a little too many because June happened and I did not read as much. I do think part of this actually could be a result of the fact that I was reading Pond by Clarice Louise Bennett, which happens to be Fitzcarraldo's like #1 best-selling book for whatever reason, and that really put me in a slump. I have like 50 pages to go, so hopefully I do finish it, but I just wasn't getting on with it necessarily. Like it is, so there's some interesting writing, but it's also just really slow and boring. Anyways, that kind of put me into a bit of a slump, and then I only ended up reading 5 books in June. The first one was The Days of Abandonment by Eleanor Ferrante. I read this with Charles and Nathan. It was a buddy read, and it also happened to be my first Eleanor Ferrante fiction. Now, for those of you that don't know, The Days of Abandonment tells the story. Literally the first line of this novel is, I found out my husband is leaving me, da 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 da. Like, that's the first story, that's the setup. And that was, you know, once again, another one of these stories about marriage. And our main character, Olga, finds this out by her husband, and her life spirals. She's been abandoned, and she really feels it, and she's so upset and so distraught because she's remembering how as a child she heard her mother speaking of this woman in the neighborhood whose husband also left her, and everyone kept on calling her, you know, this poor thing, like this poor woman. And she saw how as a child she sees how this woman became haggard and, you know, mean, and just the life circumstances really affected her. And Olga, the main character, she doesn't want to be like that, yet she finds herself becoming that because she's so heartbroken and upset that she has been discarded so cruelly and so just without a care. And she becomes obsessed with, like, you know, figuring out who it was, what happened, and also just looking at her life and being like, what is this? Why did this happen to me? And she's really just going through a tough time. And then it all kind of culminates on what, as she describes, is the worst day of her life, where, you know, things just go bad. They go from bad to worse, actually. And then she ends up, I don't know, I thought it was good, but it was also a really challenging read because I found it to be so upsetting how she does spiral and lose it because of this man. And, you know, you want to be like, don't do it, no man is worth it, but at the same time it's like, how can you make someone feel better in one of these situations? Like, it's very believable that this is what would happen, that a woman would feel the things that she's feeling and just be so upset and so distraught. So that was that book. Then I read Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, which is also my first novel by this author, and I was really, really, really disappointed. Considering that this is such an easy book to read, it took me like 2 weeks. I did not enjoy this reading experience, and one would say, like, just DNF it, just give it up. But the thing is, I wanted to see how it would finish. But though the premise of this novel is amazing, 100% hilarious. If you guys haven't heard, it's basically the story of two girls. One of the girls is Asian, the other one is white. The Asian girl dies right in front of the white girl, and the white girl steals her manuscript and runs with it. And that's so funny. That is such a great premise, but the execution of this book was not for me. I thought the writing was really bad, and it was very heavy-handed and the author's perspective, and I really felt like you could feel the author telling you her perspective. It was literally like the author's like standing on a soapbox being like preaching to you, and as a reader I didn't really like being spoken down to in that capacity, and I wished there was more subtlety and nuance. After those two reading experiences, I read another book about marriage. This one is aptly called My Husband by Maud Ventura. This is the author's debut novel, I believe, and this is a lot of fun. This is another good beach read because it's just very like juicy and fun. It's basically the story of this woman. We're looking at 1 week in her life, and she kind of has like a bit of the synesthesia where on every day of the week, a different color stands out to her. Like Monday is yellow, Sunday's white, and on those days, like that color speaks to her when she's in a good mood and like brightens things up. But if she's in a bad mood, that color takes on like a darker undertone. Basically, throughout this week, she is obsessed with her husband and really like analyzing everything he does or doesn't do, and she's looking at her relationship to her husband, to other men, and seeing this where love and marriage fits into her life, and she places such a huge prominence on it. I would say that as a reading experience, maybe like 60% of the way through, you're kind of going to get to this point where you're like, where are we going? What's happening? Like, get to the point. I get it. You're obsessed with him. Get over yourself. But stick with it and get to the ending because it's fun. It's just literally, it's just so good. That ending really was very unexpected and just took this book to the next level for me. Okay, then after that, I read a silly little astrology book. I read Trust Your Timing by Alice Bell. I follow Alice Bell on Instagram and felt a desire to support, but also I was curious to see what the book was about. I think that if you are astro inclined, you may already know a lot of these things. And after that, I did a nonfiction book, Prairie Fires, The Late American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder's by Carolyn Fraser. This book is phenomenal. I was not, an obsessed Laura Ingalls Wilder's reader as a child, but I did read the books and, have a relationship to the body of work. And I never would have thought that Laura Ingalls Wilder's was such a interesting character, but she is. And this book is really looking at what the truth of those novels were, because those novels, though they weren't actually like truth, were labeled as truth. Laura Ingalls Wilder's, towards the end of her life, gave a speech where she was like, these books are truth, but they are not all the truth. And the author is looking at that, but they're not all the truth. She's looking at what the reality of Laura Ingalls Wilder's life was, and looking at the state of the US, and you just learn so much information about history, Laura Ingalls Wilder's relationships, especially her relationship with her daughter. That is probably the one that takes up the most real estate in this book, because both mother and daughter had a very tenuous and strained relationship. It was very codependent. Think Lorelai and Rory from Gilmore Girls, but darker, because for whatever reason, Rose Wilder, the daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, felt her mother was very oppressive and tried to branch out from her family, but would always come back to them. And it felt very like evocative of being a child, an adult child in this day and age where the financial constraints are such that it's almost very hard, I think, to try to endeavor to do things on your own if you don't have like any sort of familial support. And I think that kind of mirroring of growing up at that time versus growing up now is just so fascinating. I think you really learn a lot about like manifest destiny and the making of so many of America's ideals and like self-sufficiency and what does it mean to be like self-sufficient, which is such a big American idea, but actually through looking at like the history and through looking at in particular Laura Ingalls Wilder's family's history, you learn that self-sufficiency is just an idea, one that very few are actually able to achieve. And I think this book is phenomenal. I learned so much. I do also think that the mother-daughter relationship, that exploration, as I've said previously, so good. Like literally just fascinating. I learned so much that I hadn't expected beforehand, and I literally came away from this thinking like Laura Ingalls Wilder was such a strong woman. Obviously she's not perfect. She did have a temper and, you know, whatever, but such a strong woman and such a hard worker and so good, so phenomenal. And then after that you see like the death of Laura Ingalls Wilder, how Rose is meddling and her weird little like, she would kind of like get these young men, because she never ends up having children, she would kind of like adopt them. They would become like an adopted son, or she'd be their guardian, or there'd be like this, what eventually ends up happening, this one guy who kind of becomes her grandson and then her heir. She gives him everything. He works in politics and he's kind of a weird guy. And you just see how, because of her meddling in Laura Ingalls Wilder's estate towards the end, how the estate of Laura Ingalls Wilder goes to him, and then, you know, I ended up reading a little bit afterwards, ends up going to his adopted daughter. And it's just very fascinating to see how an author's estate can change hands like that to someone who is not part of the family and not who Laura intended the estate to go to. So, that was everything that I read in the last 2 months. July's reading has also been a little slow. I think I'll probably end up closing the month with only having read 5 or 6 books, but whatever, it's summer and I'm just taking things easy. I would love to know at this point in the video, what was your favorite May, June read? How's your reading going? What's happening? Please let me know. I would love to hear, and thank you so much for watching.